How someone communicates has the power to help build or undermine relationships. This explains why it's important for trainers to recognize the communication style that they employ when communicating with trainees. Although there are different ways of describing communication styles, we focus here on three. Styles that promote interpersonal relationships and by extension facilitate training and development include assertive and supportive communication. In turn, we contrast them with aggressive communication, which tends to make people defensive and thereby undermines instructor effectiveness. It's also important to note that the difference between style and content exists and is a strong predictor of success in communication. Although few people like being on the receiving end of negative information, they tend to be much more receptive to it when it's delivered in either an assertive or supportive style. Among the clearest ways to discern whether someone is engaging in aggressive or assertive and supportive communication is the extent to which someone says you as opposed to I. People who communicate aggressively tend to use you more often. The implication of saying you is that it distances the speaker. You need to do that, for example, or why did you do that? These seem like demands or accusations. At best, this style of communication is transactional, but even when viewed in that way, it fails to recognize or build relationship. People with a more assertive or supportive style tend to use I with greater frequency. When people say I, they're often taking responsibility and providing an explanation. There's less blame and more cooperation. Other characteristics of assertive and supportive communication include being more honest and direct, but also fair and tactical. From a training and development perspective, these create an environment more conducive to learning. People also communicate nonverbally, and it's important that both read those nonverbal messages and consider what messages you're sending through your nonverbal communication. Most of the time, when people think about nonverbal communication, they're thinking of kinesic behavior, encompassing messages communicated with gestures and posture. A potential problem with nonverbal communication, though, is lack of explicitness, which can result in multiple interpretations. In employment situations, this problem is particularly acute with haptics, or communications through touch. Receiving a pat on the back for a job well done is a classic example. Unfortunately, the physical nature of haptics can be off-putting to some people and may be interpreted as sexually harassing. Therefore, you should be cautious when engaging in this form of communication. A third category of nonverbal communication is prosthetics. Prosthetics involves messages communicated through the use of physical space. Chromatics involves the use of time and can help denote how important someone views a relationship. If someone is frequently made to wait and or wait a long time, that communicates that he or she is not particularly important. Organizations are paying closer attention to the benefits of improvisational training for improved communication, creativity, conflict management, and negotiation outcomes. There's a difference between hearing and listening. What most people really want to know is whether someone is listening. Hearing is basically just an awareness of or response to a stimulus. Unlike listening, hearing does not necessarily involve conscious thought or effort. For training and development to be effective, listening needs to go both ways. Trainees need to fully understand what's being taught. Trainers need to successfully adapt their instruction to what participants need. It's useful to think of listening as a continuum of behaviors, referred to as passive, attentive, and active listening. At the lowest level, people are simply sensing, but they become more effective listeners. They also engage in processing and responding. When people listen passively, they may hear what the other person is saying, but they're unlikely to fully comprehend what is being said. The passive listener may not be looking for key words that provide context or structure. It's also possible to start at a higher level of listening, but then descend into passivity. This frequently occurs when people really want to say or ask something so strongly that they cease to follow the conversation or lecture. Attentive listening is an improvement over passive. Here, listeners understand more of what's being said but are still not fully engaged. The highest level of listening is active listening. Individuals who listen actively are fully engaged in the discussion or training. One of the first things that active listeners do is to make efforts to hear what the speaker is saying. While hearing may not be sufficient for understanding, it's a necessary condition. Active listeners also remove distractions. Active listeners also consider the whole message. They keep in mind the context of the conversation and speaker and watch for nonverbal communication. Active listeners don't assume that they got the message correct the first time. Asking clarifying questions confirms the message, improves understanding, and validates the importance of the message and the messenger. When the listener asks questions or summarizes what was said, this allows the original speaker to correct any misunderstanding. Employees need feedback, but many people avoid providing it. Some people simply don't think feedback is necessary or effective. This can reflect an external locus of control where the belief is that people can't sufficiently control outcomes. It is also common for individuals to be performing well, but it doesn't occur to the trainer or supervisor to provide feedback, or they may feel it is important but simply don't make the time to provide it. Discomfort is another reason people avoid providing feedback. Particularly if someone is not doing a good job, the trainer may not want to be mean or they may be concerned with how the employee will react. Despite these reasons for not providing feedback, the benefits that employees and organizations gain explain why it's a skill worth developing. Positive feedback is provided when someone is doing a good job. People both like and need this type of feedback. Positive feedback recognizes good performance, reinforces behavior, and lets individuals know how they're progressing towards a goal. If someone doesn't receive positive feedback, they may become demotivated, or they may change their behavior because it wasn't made clear to them what they should be doing or why they should be doing it, which could impair their performance. Constructive feedback is provided when performance does not meet expectations. This type of feedback identifies what employees are doing wrong and what steps they need to take to correct the performance issue. The goal of constructive feedback is that by helping employees change their behavior, performance improves. Without constructive feedback, performance issues tend to persist. Negative feedback is delivered more aggressively. Although negative feedback also informs employees that they're doing something wrong, it usually fails to do so in a way that facilitates behavioral change. While knowing when to provide feedback is important, trainers should not lose sight of the actual content of the feedback. The first thing to remember is that feedback should be specific. Specific feedback helps to focus the conversation and clarifies which behavior should be reinforced or corrected. Vague feedback is not particularly useful. Feedback, especially when it's meant to be constructive, should be verifiable. Besides providing clarifications, examples increase the legitimacy of feedback and decrease the chances that someone will react defensively. The last aspect of providing feedback to keep in mind is how to deliver it. The delivery of feedback is particularly important when it's not positive. Feedback should be objective. Objectivity means that you're not getting personal and are treating the other person in a professional manner. Keeping feedback balanced tends to make a person more receptive to it. When possible, when you're telling someone to correct a behavior, it's a good practice to provide some positive feedback. People from other cultures may respond differently to the same type of feedback. For example, in some cultures, a balanced delivery is not as effective. In a perfect world, people being trained, coached, or mentored would fully engage in the process. But at times, trainers, coaches, and mentors experience conflict with participants. A trainer, mentor, or coach should be adept at effectively managing conflict. The first step in resolving conflict successfully is to correctly diagnose it in order to choose the appropriate resolution style. One element of conflict, represented by the x-axis, is the importance of the outcome. A second element, represented by a y-axis, is the importance of the relationship. Most of us have a preferred conflict style, but it may not be appropriate in a given situation. Recognizing the appropriateness of your preferred conflict resolution style can make you a better trainer, coach, or mentor. When thinking about conflict resolution in the context of training, the importance of the relationship and the outcome can be anticipated, so it's possible to be somewhat prescriptive as to which style should or shouldn't be used. Among the 5 conflict resolution styles, some are more or less likely to be effective when engaged in training. Specifically, avoidance, accommodation, and competition are less likely to be effective. Conversely, compromise and collaboration are expected to be more effective. Knowing which styles to use in training or development will lead to having more successful outcomes regarding employee learning and growth. In a training or development context, it is unlikely that avoidance will ever be the most appropriate method. There's some level of importance to the outcome of training or development and to the relationship between participants. Although accommodation or competition may be appropriate at times, these conflict resolution styles are generally less effective in training or development contexts. This is because each of the styles takes a relatively extreme position. People who choose accommodation are basically making the decision that the relationship is more important than what the other person is or isn't doing. The reason people engage in training or development is to learn, grow, and change. If trainers, coaches, or mentors allow people that are working to persist in their behavior, they're not doing their job. At the other end of the spectrum from accommodation is competition. When individuals choose to resolve a conflict through competition, they're basically saying that the only thing that matters is the outcome. Compromise and collaboration styles balance the needs of the relationship as well as the outcome. They're more in keeping with the ethos of training and development and should therefore lead to better results. A person can have a distributive mindset where conflict is concerned in a zero-sum game or an integrative mindset where a win-win scenario is possible. Of the remaining conflict resolution styles, compromise is the most consistent with a distributive mindset, where the two parties in conflict are working with a fixed value and simply divide it between them. So, while compromise shows a general willingness to work with the other person, the outcome is somewhat limited. While the results should be good, they're not as likely to maximize an individual's potential. By comparison, collaboration is more likely to maximize the potential of the opportunity and to fully meet the needs of those involved. Because collaboration takes advantage of a more integrative mindset, there's a greater willingness to engage in problem solving and be more creative. While the results of collaboration can be superior to those of compromise, it does not take more effort. Self-awareness is knowing your motivations, preferences, and personality, and understanding how these factors influence your judgment, decisions, and interactions. There will be moments when you're leading or participating in training sessions when you're faced with an issue that stretches your abilities or triggers you to have a negative reaction. Understanding why a situation is challenging is important to help you manage and avoid the problem in the future. Self-awareness can also help you communicate more clearly, manage training sessions more effectively, and navigate potential conflict. Finally, as you finish leading a training session and are debriefing or adjusting for the future, it's important to understand how your own strengths and weaknesses contributed to the success of training. Being willing to get feedback that may be less than positive is enhanced by being self-aware and clear about your strengths and weaknesses. We develop our self-concept by examining our behaviors, personality, attitudes, and perceptions, along with understanding the perceptions of others that have of us. We also explore and learn about ourselves when we encounter diverse experiences. For every new experience, we gain new information about who we are and what we like or dislike. All of these factors influence our self-concept and help us to be a better trainer or trainee. One method we can use to be more self-aware is to develop our emotional intelligence, which is the ability to perceive, understand, regulate, and use emotions well in oneself and in others. For the purpose of training and development, it can be beneficial for all employees, whether trainers or trainees, to find ways to develop their ability to understand their emotions. Emotional intelligence is hierarchical, meaning that ability grows as you master each level of emotional intelligence. At the base is perceiving and identifying emotions. In order to be emotionally intelligent, you must be able to identify an emotion and recognize it in yourself and others. The next level is using emotions, followed by understanding, and lastly, managing emotion. We all experience emotions, but the ability to strategically use emotions and control their use is important in any manager, trainer, or employee.